All right, so this video is going to review chapter 1 of your textbook. A good way to kind of think about these concepts is to think about psychology as a tree. So the roots of that tree are going to be philosophy and physiology. Now we're still sort of using the tree as a guide here. So the next part of the tree we're going to talk about is its. So at the very bottom of that tree is something called structuralism. Okay, so structuralism originally came from this idea of introspection, or at the time it was called internal perception. All right, and then that morphed into structuralism. One of the students of the father of psychology, he developed this idea of structuralism, or basically trying to understand the component parts of all of your internal experiences. The next part of that tree is something called functionalism. So the father behind functionalism is William James. So William James leaned on the ideas of Darwin or evolution to understand not just the internal experience of the organism, but what behaviors were functional or what helped them to it. Now that we have went over the basic foundations or trunk of that tree, we're going to talk about some of the main branches. So the first significant branch is something called psychoanalysis, which was discovered and founded by Freud. This is one of the most well-known aspects of psychology. Psychoanalysis tries to understand how our internal thoughts that we may or may not be aware of are influencing our behavior and overall well. The next significant branch of psychology is something called Gestalt psychology. And so the basic principle here is that the individual parts of one's experience do not really identify or comprise the whole. So it's sort of a contradiction to the very beginning or structuralism. The next significant branch is something called behaviorism. So behaviorism is the basic idea that who you are fundamentally is based in your environment and experience. And for our purposes, the last significant branch is humanism. So humanism is going to reject the notion that we are simply our experiences or our unexpressed thoughts, and that we are capable of amazing things because we are human. So like this valuing of our humanness and of our free will and choice to improve. So this is where you see the shift in psychology from calling people patients to clients. I want you to use the tree as a way of thinking about or understanding all these different aspects of psychology, and this will also be on your quiz. So in this next section, we're going to talk about research methodologies. So research methodologies, the basic idea is that they help us try to understand information with the least bias possible. That does not always mean they're successful. We're going to talk about some of the drawbacks and some of the early developments in psychology and areas for improvement. Another concept that we're going to talk about often in this course, and particularly in this section, is the concept of a theory, and how a theory is different in science than it is the way that we use it colloquially. So in science, when we use the word theory, it basically means a well-constructed set of ideas that supports existing data. And if we get new data, we can either keep our existing ideas and restructure it, or sometimes if it's really too much, we have to throw away that idea entirely and start over. Another way you can kind of think about this is like it's like a well-constructed bag, okay? And all the existing evidence fit into that bag, and the bag is the theory. So there are different types of research that we can do: descriptive and causal. We're going to start with descriptive and the different methods in which you can collect data. So the first one is observational, and that's just what it sounds like. You're going to observe someone in their natural habitat or environment and watch their behavior. The next one is a survey. So this is where you send out information to people, and then once those people respond, you use that information to try to create correlations or the very beginnings of understanding phenomena. Archival research is taking existing data, so people's existing information from perhaps a mental health clinic, and trying to look at that data to see if you can find any trends or patterns. And we have longitudinal and cross-sectional research. So longitudinal research is when you follow the same individual or individuals over the course of time. So you might follow a kindergartner until the 5th grade to understand how elementary school affects an individual's development. Cross-sectional research means you have the same question, but you're answering it differently. So for example, you might follow a kindergartner for 1 year, and in that same year you might also follow a 1st grader, a 2nd grader, and so on. So by the end of year 1, you have information on the transition from kindergarten to 1st grade to 2nd, and so on. So once you've collected your data and you want to try to make conclusions about that data, there are different ways that people can go about doing that. So one of those ways is correlations. So keep in mind, important, correlation does not equal causation. So a correlation describes a relationship between two variables, okay? That means that the two variables are related, but you don't know how or why. You can guess the how or why, but you don't really know for certain. So I'm going to take some practical correlations that you may have heard of before. So one is, as murder rates go up, ice cream sales go up. Now, does this mean that murder rates cause ice cream sales to go up? No, the two things are correlated. They're positively correlated, meaning that as one goes up, the other one is going up at the same time, okay? Another example of a positive correlation is when the two things go in the same direction. So as one thing goes down, another thing goes down. A negative correlation is when one thing goes up and one thing goes down. So for example, as age goes up, fertility goes down. Make sense? So if you do want research where you can assume causality, we're going to talk about experimental research where you can control confounding variables. So when you're able to control more of those variables, then you can start to assume causality. So first, you're going to have an experimental hypothesis, and this is going to be like a very specific statement. So if this occurs, then that will occur. And the reason it has to be so specific is so that you can figure out through an experiment if that happens or does not happen. You need to be able to determine explicitly whether or not it happens. In an experiment, you typically have an experiment group and a control group. The experiment group is going to get the thing that you change or the thing that you want to see if it works or not, and the control group is not going to receive anything. So for example, if you want to know, does breastfeeding and early contact with your infant, is that better for the infant or not, then one group is going to do that, and then the other group would do what people normally did in hospitals in the early 90s. Then you would see which group fared better. Okay, and in this scenario, you're assuming that both the experimental group and the control group are very similar on most variables. So here are two other words I need you to know for this section: an independent variable and a dependent variable. An independent variable is the thing that the experimenter manipulates, and a dependent variable is the result of that manipulation. So here's an explicit example. So if I'm making a gumbo, right, and I want to figure out what is making my gumbo either taste phenomenal or like not my best work, okay? And let's say I change the way that I make my roux, let's say I change my sausage, and let's say I change whether or not I put onion powder in it. It will be difficult for you to determine what made it good or what made it not good. But if I only change one independent variable, so let's say I only change the sausage, and then the dependent variable or the taste is better, then you can assume that it was the sausage. And that's the way this works in science. So what we try to do is control all the other confounding variables, the roux, the different seasonings, and change one at a time, or as few as possible, and then see if that changes the end result or the dependent variable, which is the taste. So the independent sausage and the dependent, the taste. So as we went through this summary of research methods that are frequently used in psychology, we've glossed over a lot of the ethical issues that have plagued the field since its inception. So when we're going to look through these classic psychological studies, you'll start to see what I mean. The consideration for the well-being of the participants, whether they're human or animal, were often a secondary concern, which is why now in psychology, you have a strict ethics board. This board is called the Institutional Review Board. So on Canvas, you will be able to access some of the experiments done in science in general and psychology in particular, and some of their major pitfalls. I want you to review that and the ethical guidelines.